Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are joining us from, where you are located. We can see that you're coming in. If you want to, please use the chat function to let us know where you're joining us from. We are delighted to welcome you to our webinar today titled the AAITE National Code of Ethics for Interpreters and Translators in Education, a New Mindset. My name is Analia, and I am the Manager of Training and Curriculum at Cross Cultural Communications, the largest international training agency for community, educational, and medical interpreting. And I will be your host for today's one-hour webinar. Also, behind the scenes is my colleague, Andrew Hall, Cross-Cultural Communications Publication Manager. Andrew will manage the chat and will provide useful information throughout the webinar. Lastly, behind the scenes, but with us today, we have Hilda Tejada. She is a conference interpreter and trainer based in Mexico City, whose working languages include English, Spanish, and Mexican Sign Language. She generously offered to provide Spanish interpretation for this webinar so that several teams of non-English speaking sign language interpreters that she works with could attend. If you choose, you may switch to the Spanish audio channel by clicking on the interpretation button near the bottom of the window. Si lo desea, puede cambiar al canal de audio en español pulsando el botón de interpretación situado en la parte inferior de la ventana. Thank you for joining us today, Hilda. Okay, before we begin, and as we wait for everyone, because we don't want to leave anybody behind, right? I would like to share some CC updates. CC is delighted to offer a live online session of our signature 40-hour program, the Community Interpreter International, TCII. Become a professional interpreter in medical, educational, and social services settings. This interactive and engaging program will take place live online starting June 24th through the 28th, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5:30. We only have 5 spots available, so don't miss out if you're interested. And Andrew will post the link as well. You also may be interested in the 2 one-day workshops we have coming up. This Saturday, we have the workshop titled Holding Space, Using Your Whole Self in Mental Health Interpreting. In July, we're going to offer again our very requested and on-demand training workshop titled Glossary Building for Translators and Interpreters. And Andrew will share the links as well. Okay, so let's continue. Let's go over a few things. This webinar presentation will last between 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a 15 to 20-minute Q&A period, during which, as always, you can ask our presenter questions. During the webinar, please keep the Q&A feature open and use the Q&A to submit your questions to our presenter. For other comments or questions for us here at Cross Cultural Communications, please use the chat feature instead. And if you want everyone to see your comments in the chat, please make sure your chat is set to everyone. Lastly, if you want to stay on after the presenter leaves at the end of the hour to chat with Andrew and me, We will be happy to answer any questions about both cross-cultural communications and Blue Horizon. This webinar has been approved for CE use. Please remember 24 hours after the webinar, attendees will be mailed a link to download the certificate of attendance. I also want to add that we will not share the power presentation slides. So please, 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 as always you do, pay attention. I want you to know if you don't see it right away, just a reminder, the certificate of attendance will go to the mail you used to register, okay, for this webinar. Please check again your spam or junk folder if you don't see it right away. Certificates are only available for attendees of the live session of this webinar. They must be downloaded within 2 months of today's session. Now, without further ado, let's begin our webinar, the AAITE National Code of Ethics for Interpreters and Translators in Education, a new mindset. And I have the pleasure to introduce our presenter, Carola Lehmacher. Let me tell you about Carola. She's impressive to say the least. Carola is a 2023-2024 MCI candidate, a federally certified court interpreter, FCCI, for Spanish, and a registered court interpreter for German for the state of Georgia. She works as a conference interpreter for various local and international clients in all of her working language combinations, and is one of the voices, how fun is this, of a major news network where she interprets live shows that are broadcasted throughout the news channel to Spanish-speaking viewers. That's so much fun, Carola. Also, Carola holds 2 university degrees in translation studies and various certificates in interpreting. She is also licensed trainer of the Community Interpreter International, and I don't know where she finds the time, volunteers with the American Association of Interpreters and Translators in Education, AAITE, as a chair of the Ethics and Standards Committee. Carola, it is such a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for just giving from your time and your expertise, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Analia and Andrew in the background, and thank you to Cross Cultural Communications for having me present another webinar for you. And thank you, Analia, for getting all the boring stuff about myself out of the way. I had a slide with my bio, but I think we will be able to skip over that. So let's dive right into the presentation. And today I'm talking to you in my capacity as chair of the Ethics and Standards Committee of the American Association of Interpreters and Translators in Education. And I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but we're going to have a poll in a second where we will get a feeling for that. The AAITE published their National Codes of Ethics in December of 2023. And yes, this is right. It is codes, not one code. This is not a typo, because we actually did publish 2. One code of ethics for interpreters and one code of ethics for translators. And we will dive into the reasons of why we did that in just a little bit throughout the presentation. So for you to get a feel of what we're going to do today, I'm going to share some background information with you. Then we're going to discuss the process of how this code of ethics came into existence. And then we're going to discuss some items that constitute a mindset shift from other codes of ethics that are already available in the field. And here we have my slide with my bio and presentation, but Analia already went over that, so I don't need to discuss that with you. I think the important thing for you to know is, as I said, I am here representing AAITE as the chair of the Ethics and Standards Committee, and I was part of the leadership group that led and guided the efforts to creating this document. So let's hear from you. Would like to get a feeling for who is in the room today. I know we have a ton of participants logging in, and probably some more will join us later. But I would like to launch a quick poll for you just to get a feel of how much information you bring to the table for this specific webinar. So the first question is what setting do you work mostly in? So think about the bulk of your work, like 70 to 75%. In what setting is it? Okay, I see that there are a lot of medical interpreters and educational in the second spot. Great, we will discuss some of the differences there. I would also like to know how much experience you have in the field. And then question 3 is whether you're familiar with other codes of ethics that are available to professional interpreters in the field, be it the one for medical interpreters, be it the one for interpreters in legal settings, or the one for the education setting, which is the topic of today's presentation. I know that there are many other code of ethics out there. I just chose to name a couple so that we would have a reference document for this presentation. Okido. Great. And if you don't want to answer the poll, that's fine. There is no need to. It's just a good way for me to get a feel for where we stand and what questions might come up later on. Okido, I'm going to end the poll now. Thank you to all of you who participated and for sharing all of this information with me. I would now like for you to write in the chat, what do you think that a code of ethics is, and why do you think that we need one? So I have the chat open on my end, and you can start sharing your answers in there. Thank you for printing and binding those copies of the Code of Ethics. That is great to hear. Wonderful. So share with me in the chat, why do you think that we as a profession need a Code of Ethics and what the purpose of it is? Okay, I see expectations. I like that. I like guiding principles. Standards, great. Foundation. Privacy, okay, that was more related to one of the tenets, but that's great. Set of rules, professionalism, to establish standards of competency, boundaries. Wonderful. Yes, I like all of that. Keep it coming. Better practices. Yes, definitely. All of the answers you're sharing in there are great. So we need to take into consideration what a code of ethics does. And a code of ethics defines the core values and principles that guide our decision-making process. And there are codes of ethics for every type of profession. It's not just for us interpreters that there is one, but nurses have one, and doctors have one, and attorneys have some, right? But it defines, as I said, the core values and principles. This gives us guidance. And then a code of ethics also has a greater purpose, which is to safeguard the individual and society at large, right? The code of ethics is not only useful for us as professionals in the field, it is also important for all of the other stakeholders that have access to this document. Why? Because it sets the expectations. It tells every party involved how the professional in the field is supposed to behave and what expectations they may have, right? And it unifies the criteria. It sets standards. All of a sudden, if we're bound by a code of ethics, every professional in the field should comply with a certain set of standards to follow along. So we already know that there are several codes of ethics out there, right? There are code of ethics for medical interpreters, there are code of ethics for legal interpreters, even for conference interpreters. So with all of this wide array of code of ethics available, why do we actually need a code of ethics for translators and interpreters in education? And this is a very logical question, right? If we have so many code of ethics out there, why was there a need to create a new one? And I see Somaya answering in the chat to saying for transparency. Does anybody have any other ideas why we would need a specific code for education? Yes, I see somebody say we do it all. Medical, legal, communicate. Different working contexts, consistencies. Education is different. Yes, totally. Education is different. The education setting is a specialization at the crossroads, right? What does this mean? At the Ethics and Standards Committee, we conducted research over several years. And this research revealed to us that ethical challenges that arise in the educational encounters are very different with regards to their complexity, but they're also very unique in their nature. And these complexities that we perceived in the field through our research were not adequately addressed in existing code of ethics. This is the only setting where legal, medical, community, and conference interpreting regularly overlap. And also, we have to take into consideration that in the educational field, we do not only have us interpreters involved, but we also need to take into account the language access legislation, disability legislation. We are interacting with stakeholders in a wide array of encounters. There's programs, there's mandates. And in this specialization, the limited English proficient communities require access to language services often over a very long period of time, sometimes during the entire schooling of their children. And these settings that we face in the educational specialization or the educational field can sometimes be adversarial. So for example, when we think of an expulsion hearing, there are two parties that are kind of confronted and they do not want the same goal. But then we also have collaborative settings where we may have a student who is missing too many days of school, and we have the parents in an encounter with the school administrators trying to find a solution to this issue. So this very complex nature of different settings and different types of encounter arising made it necessary to publish a specialized, up-to-date code of ethics and standards of practice. While we were doing the research into the time frame and the information that we needed to create our own document, we decided that we needed a different approach. And the approach that we decided to apply as a committee is both revolutionary and evolutionary, because we decided that we wanted to go beyond the traditional approach that was underlying existing code of ethics. We realized that the code of ethics in the field did no longer fully meet the needs of interpreters and translators in the field. And we decided to go beyond that. And there are several reasons why we did that in several different aspects that I'm going to discuss with you throughout the presentation. We decided, based on our research, that although interpreting and translation share many similarities, they are two completely distinct professions. Interpreters have a separate skill sets and have different requirements than interpreters. But what we were seeing in the field is that these two professions were often folded into just a single job position. And it had been like that for decades. And we had bilingual school staff who had translation duties, but were also assumed to be able to do both translation and interpreting whenever there was needed. And there was little recognition for that. We decided that we wanted to stop further legitimizing this practice and decided that only if we created two separate codes of ethics, one for interpreters and one for translators, we could effectively address the unique requirements and practices of each of these professions. So if you are a translator working in the educational field, I will share the link later. Please download that code of ethics. If you're an interpreter, please download the other code of ethics. And if you work in both professions, wonderful, then you can download both and hopefully they'll be of good guidance to you. The other thing that we realized during our research and while we were drafting the code of ethics is that context matters. We are a human profession. We work in an intersection of educators and legislation and policies and families. And the complexity and the unique nature of this field told us that we needed a document that did not dictate in a very rigid way how we should act and what the outcome should be, but rather that we needed to encourage critical thinking and responsible judgment that would allow us to adhere to ethical considerations when we had to navigate professional situations and dilemmas. What happens in interpreting encounters is that ethical challenges and the dilemmas that we face are not questions that can be simply answered with right or wrong or good or bad. Because the greatest challenge that we face when we have to make ethical professional decisions is that usually right versus right is confronted. We have a personal value that conflicts with our professional expectations, or we have two values that conflict with one another. And sometimes this scenario, both of these happen at the same time in a single encounter. So when we think about ethics, right? Ethics can be looked at from two different perspectives. First, we have what we call normative or prescriptive kind of ethics. And these usually describe what interpreters in a given field should do, how they should behave, what should happen. And it sometimes feels very mechanical and very uninvolved because it doesn't really provide that much guidance on how you should apply the ethics. Descriptive ethics, on the other hand, is based on an analysis on what happens in the field, how the practitioners of a specific profession behave, and it provides us some degree of flexibility according to the context, to other factors that come into play during the work setting. We need to focus on describing what values-based ethics is, and we need to provide guidance with our code of ethics and how to best apply the ethics or the ethical guidance that a document provides when we face an ethical dilemma. And that is why, to us, flexibility does not mean that we can do whatever we want, but it also means that whenever we are facing an ethical dilemma, we need to, on the one hand, take into consideration the norms, that would be our ethical principles, but we also need to make a reality check. We need to make sure what the context is and what other factors come into play at that specific moment. And this allows us to have some degree of flexibility. And I repeat, this degree of flexibility does not mean that we can do whatever we want. We have to picture us on a road on the mountain, and the ethical principles and the reality check are like the guardrails. And within those guardrails, we have some flexibility, some margin to decide what action is the most ethical one in a given context. So let's see how we arrived at this conclusion. The Ethics and Standards Committee developed an 11-step process to guide us from the initial stages when we started conducting our research to the publication of our document. And I can tell you this was not a 100-meter race or not even a 400-meter race. This was a marathon. It took us over 2 years to get to the end result that I'm going to share with you in the chat later on. So in the beginning, we decided on the mission and the purpose of the committee, and we also determined the approach and the process that we were going to apply. And with this work, our main objective was obviously to develop a code of ethics and the corresponding standards of practice, but we also wanted to lend stature to the interpreting and translation roles in education. We wanted to provide unified criteria, and we wanted to establish expectations and norms to guide and support the profession. In our approach, we recognize the relevance of existing code of ethics and standards of practice, but we also had a feeling and a deep desire to identify new findings that would reflect the reality and the real world experiences on the job, right? We wanted to create a document that served as guidance for the decision-making process, but we also wanted to keep in mind that many of the professionals working in the field of education have dual roles. And this is a huge challenge when it comes to interpreting. We also wanted to explore any overlaps with other fields and also take the existing code of ethics and work as a foundation for us. So in the early stages, we conducted focus groups and we started gathering information. And we also evaluated the existing codes of ethics. We heard from all stakeholders. We heard from school administrators, from parents who we served. We heard from interpreters and translators in the field, every type of stakeholder that you can imagine. We looked at different code of ethics, not only those existing within the United States and within different fields, but we also consulted local reference documents and we looked into code of ethics from other countries. And what we did with all of that information is we pre-selected some tenets and the corresponding standards of practice that we thought would be useful to guide our initial work and data analysis. Because of course, there is no need to reinvent the wheel, but we also had a specific goal in mind is what I mentioned in the beginning is finding those gaps. Where was the current situation or the current documents not helping us in our profession? So when we reached this stage, we decided that we wanted to formalize our information gathering and we conducted the national survey. And we wanted to identify with this survey where a code of ethics and standards of practice specifically for the education field would help fill those gaps. So here you can see a big chart from all the states that participated. We are very much aware of all the local efforts that are being carried out in the different fields. We have committee members representing many different states. So we're constantly involved in the process and also up to date with information going on. But from all of the information we gathered in this survey, we quickly came to the conclusion that whatever was happening in the field was not reflected in the current code of ethics. So with all the information that we gathered in this national survey, we started to dissect the information and we kind of grouped it under what could be under a similar umbrella, right? So everything that was kind of related to impartiality was grouped in one place. Then we had all the concerns related to accuracy, for example. Many of these situations that everybody shared with us was that multiple ethical situations and ethical issues were actually popping up in different situations. And we decided that we wanted to make sure that all of the concerns shared with us during that information and data gathering stage was then reflected and addressed in our document. We did not want a document that just said yes or no, or do this or do that. We wanted a document that could help all the professionals working in the field so that they could use it as guidance and go back to it whenever they face an ethical dilemma in their practice. So the next stage for us was defining the tenets and the standards of practice that we actually wanted to include in our document. And once this was done, we went through the review stage. Our first draft was reviewed by the AAITE board. After that, it was reviewed by AAITE members. How did we do that? In May of 2023, we held our annual conference in Denver, Colorado. It is called the EduCon. And during a breakout session, we invited all of the AAITE members to join us in the room and provide us feedback. So we had about 80 members present during this review stage, and over the period of 1 hour, we shared the documents with them, and they reviewed it and made comments. After that, we went back as a committee, reworked everything on the information provided, on the feedback provided by our members, and after that, we submitted this document to review to stakeholders. The committee leadership and the board selected a group of stakeholders from very distinct backgrounds. So we had academia presented, we had interpreter trainers, we had practitioners, we had service administrators, advocates, community members, and also representatives of professional associations. We had working professionals in the field, some specialize in translation, others specialize in interpreting, and all of them gave us feedback. We wanted validation and assurance that we had comprehensively addressed all of the aspects of the work and that all of the suggested ethical principles and standards of practice were not just aspirational. We wanted our ethical principles and standards of practice to be practical and also capable of being implemented. And after all of this process and all of these steps, we were finally able to publish our documents. And this is what they look like. And I'm going to share the link to these documents in the chat. They are free to download for everyone. And for some reason, it is not pasting in the chat. So I'm sure that you can find them on the website, or maybe somebody else can share the link to them if it doesn't work. Thank you. I already see that somebody has pasted it in there. I don't know why it isn't working on my end. So thank you for sharing those. I truly, truly hope that you will take the time to download the documents and go through the preface and read it and familiarize yourself with the documents, because there's a lot of research work behind them. And you will see that there are very specific examples for the different standards of practice that will guide you in how you can solve similar issues if you ever come across them. So I have already discussed several items that are important. For example, that I already mentioned that we decided to have 2 separate code of ethics for translators and for interpreters, because we believe that these are 2 very distinct professions. But I also want to go a little bit deeper into why we consider that this is a new mindset. This is not only a new mindset because of how this code of ethics were created. We were not a group of people who decided, okay, this is how it should be done in the field. No, we went to the field and gathered information from the field to inform our decision and our drafting process. And that is very evolutionary and revolutionary in the way we look at ethics. And I cannot stress this enough, because how can we as a group decide what needs to happen in this profession if we do not know what is going on in the field? So when we decided to draft 2 codes of ethics, the one for interpreters and the one for translators, we realized that drafting the code of ethics for translators did not pose the multifaceted challenges that the code of ethics for interpreters presented. And this is mainly due to the fact that translators are not affected by the on-the-spot micro decisions interpreters need to make. Translators are not under the pressure of navigating the dialogue that is taking place, the back and forth, right? And under normal circumstances, translators often have time to research any issues that arise during the translation process. And they can also consult with colleagues, provided they maintain confidentiality, right? So the interaction for a translator is usually an interaction with the document. And even though the translator should always keep the intent of the author and the target audience in mind during the translation process, the translator usually does not have the direct interaction with the author and the end users of the translation. And this is why the translation process is stripped of many, many hurdles. And that is why now, Specifically, I want to focus on the Code of Ethics for interpreters in education, and I want to discuss with you the 3 concepts that you see on the screen. So we have the overarching values. These also apply to the Code of Ethics for translators. But then we have the framework concepts and the strategies that apply solely to interpreters. And as we walk through this, you will get a better idea of what I mean by that. And please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. I know that I'm dumping a lot of information at you, and I am going to stay on later on to try to answer as many of your questions in the Q&A function and clarify any points that might not be clear at this point. So keep those questions coming. I cannot follow along in the chat because this is going too fast and I'm focused on the presentation, but please write all your questions in the Q&A and I'll be happy to address all of those later. So let's look at the new mindset that I just mentioned that we incorporated in our Code of Ethics. So the structure of the National Code of Ethics for Interpreters and Education is the following. We have the overarching values, and I'm going to explain all of this in detail as I go through the presentation. We have the ethics and standards of practice per se. We have our framework concepts, and we have all of the strategies for the application of ethics. So let's dive into overarching values first. Overarching values are inextricably woven throughout the application of every ethical principles, and they're therefore not ethical principles in themselves. These are fundamental principles or beliefs, right, that serve as a guiding force, not only for us as individuals, but also for us as a community, as a society. Overarching values represent a shared understanding of what we as a community consider to be right or consider to be desirable. And we believe that overarching values transcend personal interests and they provide us with a very solid and strong foundation for our ethical decision-making process. These overarching values align with the well-being of others and with the community at large. But they also determine our interactions and shape our behaviors within society. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about values such as solidarity. I'm talking about honesty. I'm talking about respect, right? If we think about the ethical principles, and we can take the accurate representation of qualification as an example here, this idea of accurately representing our qualifications is strongly permeated by the idea of honesty and respect. We can think about impartiality, for example. Impartiality is related to the overarching value of respect or non-maleficence, which is the same as do no harm. And in this way, this is just an example about how these overarching values permeate all of our ethical tenets and how everything we do, every ethical decision that we make is always going to be based also on the strong and solid foundation that these overarching values provide. Let's take a look at framework concepts. Framework concepts are those that will help us guide our ethical conduct, and they are also integrated into each individual ethical principle. We identified 2 framework concepts, and these framework concepts for us are communicative autonomy and cultural awareness. We can compare this to the structure of a house. So we have the overarching values, which I just explained to you what we refer to or what we reference with that as our foundation. And the framework concepts are the beams and the posts that create a stable structure for the building's features. And these framework concepts that for us are communicative autonomy and cultural awareness support and provide the elements necessary for ethical conduct. So for those of you who are not familiar with these concepts, let's discuss communicative autonomy first. And community autonomy is a concept that was coined by Sofia Garcia Bayard, And she stated that community autonomy is the capacity of each party in an encounter to be responsible for and in control of their own communication. We developed the National Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice for Interpreters in Education with the understanding that each party in the encounter has the right to express their thoughts, their opinions, their feelings without any intervention. And our role as interpreter is to honor this right and the speaker's autonomy. And therefore, as interpreters, we should refrain from intervening or influencing the direct communication between the parties in the encounter. So, if we effectively and appropriately apply all of the ethical principles, we are inherently supporting communicative autonomy of the parties in the encounter. If we are impartial, if we are accurate, if we do our professional development and we are continuously studying and becoming better interpreters, all of that supports the right of all of the parties in an encounter to express their thoughts without interference. The second concept that we identified as being key for us as interpreters is cultural awareness. And there's three elements to cultural awareness. First of all, we are never going to be cultural experts of absolutely everything, because I may have grown up in a country where we speak a specific language in a specific context. And I have a colleague from the same country, but she grew up in a different schooling context, and therefore her culture is different than mine, even though we come from the same country. And therefore it is important to highlight that we only have partial knowledge of a unique mix of beliefs and customs and social norms of the different cultures that we are immersed in and that we work in. We also need to recognize that our own culture shapes the way we perceive others and also shapes the way we interact with others. We will never be 100% objective because that is just part of being human. But having cultural awareness means that we have to recognize that we are only experts in our own personal culture. So the culture that I grew up in, the country that I grew up in the context that I grew up in, with the schooling that I grew up in, with the family that I grew up in, right? And how I grew up, that is my own culture, will also affect and shape the way that I perceive others and interact with others. And the third item here is that our culture is not the only culture there. There's usually at least three cultures in the room. It is me, the culture of the limited English proficient party, and the other stakeholder that is part of the interpreting encounter. There may even be more people present in the interpreting encounter. So there might be multiple cultures present in every encounter. And the presence of all of these cultures can influence the outcome of a specific meeting, of a specific encounter that we are interpreting at. So if you think about cultural awareness, we cannot, and I'm saying we cannot demonstrate the overarching values of respect, of diversity, of dignity if we do not have cultural awareness. Culture permeates absolutely everything that we do, and the language itself also carries values and beliefs and customs and the societal norms of the culture it comes from, right? Culture is a collective framework, and it is embraced and practiced by a specific group of people within a distinct cultural context, but we should never forget that culture is also something extremely personal. Let's move on to the third element that constitutes a mindset shift in the Code of Ethics that we have published. And this refers to the strategies for the application of ethics. To us, One of the most important strategies when we are faced with a dilemma, with an ethical dilemma, I should highlight, is critical thinking. Critical thinking is our ability to analyze information and to form a judgment. In order to be able to do that, we have to be aware of our own biases and assumptions. We have to be able to apply consistent standards when we think critically. I cannot highlight how pivotal critical thinking is in our ethical decision-making process. Critical thinking just empowers us to analyze, to discern, and to really navigate complex situations. And critical thinking for us is the cornerstone in the transition from what I've described to you as prescriptive ethics in the beginning, that is the do's and don'ts, to descriptive ethics, where we actually navigate the decision-making process based on the situation, where we take context into consideration. We cannot have a more descriptive point of view. That is, we cannot take into account the situation in itself that we are immersed in if we cannot think critically. And critical thinking allows us to identify all of the ethical implications that are arising in a specific encounter, but it also allows us to sort of foresee to a certain degree what potential consequences are associated with the decision that we are going to make. In order to be able to apply critical thinking within ethical dilemmas that we are facing, we need to be familiarized with our code of ethics. We need to know what the ethical principles are. We need to make the standards of practice second nature. And we need to practice how we would navigate these situations if we are ever faced with them on the spot. The second strategy that I want to highlight now is the ethical decision-making process. Ethical decision-making is not something that we just go through and say, okay, I'm just going to make that decision. No, it is actually a process during which we choose the actions or maybe the words that we will use that align with the ethical standards and with our moral principles and our values. We have to consider the potential consequences of the different choices, and we have to select the one that in that specific context and situation is the option or the solution that is the most ethically sound and just and morally defensible. Acting in an ethical manner doesn't mean that we say, okay, we applied the code of ethics and that is it. It also means that we take responsibility for our actions and that we can justify, based on the ethical principles, why we made a choice. And this is extremely important because we cannot justify our actions simply by saying, oh, we acted ethically. No, we need to be able to tell why we acted in a certain way. And this is where the ethical decision-making process and critical thinking come into place. You can refer to the CHIA ethical decision-making process to help you guide you through that process. It is extremely useful. But I'm kind of looking at the clock and I'm also seeing that I'm running out of time. So I'm not going to jump into detail here, but I'm going to discuss and talk about the elephant in the room. Because probably a lot of you, especially those who work in the medical field, which is a vast majority of you, are wondering, what about advocacy? Why is it not included as an ethical principle? And this was a big debate. And we decided that advocacy is not an ethical principle. For us at AAITE, advocacy is a strategy that we can use. And why is that? Because advocacy takes the interpreter out of their restricted role. It inserts us into the encounter with a voice of our own. And the decision to advocate requires critical thinking. With our research, we determined that advocacy is poorly understood. I know that in sign language interpreting, it is very much common common practice to do. But for spoken language interpreters, advocacy is very poorly understood. It is applied subjectively, and it is also applied inconsistently. And I've already mentioned before that in the educational setting, we have collaborative encounters, we have adversarial encounters, we have mixed encounters. And if advocacy were an ethical principle, we as interpreters would be required to speak up on behalf of somebody else, and we would do that often without the other person's full consent. And if we do that, we violate a lot of the other ethical principles. We would violate, for example, the ethical principle of impartiality. We would violate the ethical principle of professional conduct. And we would also violate the rules and the requirements set for encounters that are sometimes even prescribed by legal processes. But what is even more important is that with advocacy, we undermine the overarching values. That is, for example, the overarching values of respect that we have stated in the beginning is a foundation, but also we would not respect our ethical framework concept of communicative autonomy, because we will be taking away the ability of one or more parties to be in charge of their own communication. And for this very reason, we believe that advocacy is better framed as a strategy that interpreters should apply in conjunction with other intervention techniques, and always, always, always based on critical thinking. In any professions, practitioners will sometimes be confronted with moral dilemmas that require them to step out of their professional role and take action. But whenever that happens, we are always best served if we analyze the situation by going through our ethical decision-making process and deciding whether advocacy is really the best strategy to apply here. And we should only apply it if everything else has failed. So let me share some final thoughts before we go into the Q&A section of this presentation. I want to highlight that the goal of the National Codes of Ethics for Interpreters and Translators, published by AAITE, is not to dictate rigid regulations or impose prescriptive behaviors. That is, we don't want to tell you, oh, you have to do this or you have to do that. No, on the contrary. We want to encourage you to think critically and to make responsible judgments. And while you think critically, we want you to adhere to the ethical principles and navigate professional situations and dilemmas within those guardrails that I mentioned you before, but giving you some degree of flexibility to really take contextual factors into consideration as well. So this is it from me. Thank you very much. This is the end of the information dump and the PowerPoint slideshow. So hopefully there are some interesting questions in the Q&A function and we can address those.
Wow, Carola, thank you so much for sharing such a comprehensive presentation. Yes, there is a lot. With any time we talk about ethics, there is so much to think about, and I think to digest and to internalize, right? And I know that we don't have all the time in the world, and this is one of those topics that you can talk for hours. Thank you so much. Yes, we do have a few questions. I want to read them to you, even though I know you can read them. So let me go with the first one. It says, Carola, thank you for your information. One general question I have is related to the professional development tenet, which states that the interpreter commits to consistently improving and broadening their knowledge and skills through professional development. How do you envision the quality assurance process of the interpreting skills for the educational interpreters? Should LSPs ensure this happens for individual contractors? Could peers do that? I am curious about your thoughts around that. Thank you.
Wow.
I know there is a lot. There are like 3 questions in one.
Yes, there's like, so first of all, let me address the idea of professional development. I believe that, I believe several things. So first of all, I'm a big promoter of professional development. And professional development can take many, many different forms. Professional development can be skills building. So that is working specifically on our interpreting skills, be it on our consecutive, on our simultaneous, on our side translation. Professional development can also mean being up to date with the news, knowing what is happening in a specific country, being aware of how a language evolves in the different countries that the language we work with is spoken. So professional development has to come from an internal desire of giving the best every single day and of becoming better professionals every single day. And I know that some of us do continuous education or professional development on a more regular basis, and I know that others kind of focus on a skill, for example, during a conference or take a specific workshop and work on that, and it is more time-bound. And that is totally fine. I think the most important thing about professional development is that we continue to become better at what we do every single day. And professional development, to me, is very close to personal development. So whatever we do to get better in our profession will also help us to become a better person. And whatever we do in our personal lives to become a better person will also make us a better professional. I don't know if I have answered that question at 100%. I just think that it's important to look at it with a broader lens.
Yes.
I think peer review is always great. It's always wonderful to work with a group of colleagues who can encourage you and support you and help you to move forward. I know that there are a ton of free resources out there. I mean, just the webinar series with CCC is a great resource for anybody who wants to work on their skills. So just keep on digging and I'm sure you'll find something.
And I love your perspective, Carola. Thank you for sharing that, because it's just not one thing. It's an array of different aspects, right, of what professional development involve. Okay, now, along with that question, should LSPs ensure this happens for individual contractors? Could peers do that? So what's your opinion on this? She's curious to know your thoughts on this topic.
I think it's very hard for LSPs to force individual contractors to do professional development. The one thing that I can say is that if you're at a conference, for example, a local conference in the whatever district you work in or whatever state you're in, and your LSP is present there, let's say as a sponsor, and they see you there, it is more likely that they will hire somebody who is engaged with their professional development.
Yes.
Than somebody who is not. And then let me share the flip side of that. You, as an independent contractor, can also ask the LSP if they would be willing to provide continuing education or professional opportunities, development opportunities for you. Because maybe that is something that they had not considered as it being important for their contractors. So I don't know. Maybe
Excellent
that
point.
is some food for thought, and maybe you can get the ball rolling there.
There you go. I love that idea. I'm a firm believer of ask and it shall be given to you, or it may be given to you. Who knows? Okay, let's go to the next question. Many, if not all of us, work in multiple areas of interpretation, such as medical, legal, education. I have not read the newly published Code of Ethics for Interpreters in Education. What are the key differences between this Code of Ethics and the Code for Medical Interpreters?
Good. So first thing that I'm going to say to whoever posted that question, please read the Code of Ethics. There's a ton of information down there. I just tried to kind of condense all of it in this presentation, or a lot of it in this presentation, so that you get a glimpse at it. I know the preface is long. I wrote a big chunk of it together with two other wonderful professionals. I know there's a lot of information in there, but you need time to digest it.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the main or the two key differences is how we structure the code of ethics. First, the idea of the overarching values. So I know that respect is included as an ethical principle in some of the code of ethics. We decided that for us, it was an overarching value. It is a foundation, and it is one of those values that permeates everything that we do in our profession. Second, we have a totally different approach with regards to advocacy, which is what I presented at the end. To us, advocacy is a strategy and should not be considered an ethical principle for all of the reasons that I explained before, and I'm not going to go into detail again because otherwise we won't be able to answer any other questions. And then how culture is considered is also very different in the AAITE Code of Ethics compared to other Code of Ethics. So some Code of Ethics prohibit interpreters from being a cultural broker or from either even addressing culture in an encounter. For us, cultural awareness is what we mentioned, a framework concept, and it also permeates everything that we do. But cultural awareness in the broad sense, as I mentioned, not only being aware of the culture of the limited English proficient community or patient, for example, if we're in the medical setting, but also how our own culture permeates it and being very mindful of the fact that there's more than just one culture present in the room.
Yes.
In a nutshell.
Yes. I mean, I just as you, Carola, I would encourage everybody again, please read the AAITE Code of Ethics. If you're an interpreter, if you're a translator, then do the translator Code of Ethics. And I would even encourage everybody, we're talking about critical thinking, to read other Code of Ethics. Like I have read the RID, the AAITE, the NCIXC, the CHIA Code of Ethics, the IMIA Code of Ethics, and I'm having a hard time to pronouncing this one. I'm not sure, the NAETISL Code of Ethics, the NASL. And I think it's important to read the different Code of Ethics, see the differences that they have and why. And I think we should then, out of that, decide, okay, what do I see here? Again, it goes a lot with the critical thinking, and this is part of professional development. The more informed we are, the better choices and decisions we can make. That's my spiel for that one. Okay, let's move on. Okay, let's see.
No,
critical thinking.
And you're right. You're right, because different code of ethics were created at different stages of the profession.
Yes.
So the medical code of ethics has been published many years ago. And we have the benefit that that interpreting in education and translation in education is a profession that is starting to become more recognized and more professionalized. And for this reason, it was very important for us to not only look at what is happening in the field, and I'm getting off track here, but I do want to mention that. AAITE also conducted a job task analysis. It is available on the website for download. There is a huge report on it. And the job task analysis is the first of its kind. We collected, not me personally, the association, because I'm not part of the job task analysis committee, but they collected job descriptions from all over the country to determine what employers are looking for, and then see what skills we're bringing to the table and how they match. Because if we do not understand what is required in the field, how can we move forward in the path?
Exactly. And again, it's based on data research, right? It's not just something like, oh, we just think that this is what should be done. And that's what we need to see more in the profession. I will go to the next question, Carola, because I know you need to leave about 6 minutes. But there is a point here. This says, oh, Cindy wrote this from you. I'm like, they mentioned Cindy wrote this from Cindy wrote. Okay. If you don't know who Cindy wrote is, please Google her. She's a landmark in the field. Critical thinking is very important. I agree. Yet developing critical thinking skills takes a lot of training. Many community interpreters education included have only a high school degree and no formal training as
Okay, it looks like we lost Analia. So, okay, good. Let me see if I can find that question. Okay, I found the question in the Q&A. So let me read it out for everybody who hasn't heard it. Critical thinking is very important, yet developing critical thinking skills takes a lot of training. How do we build this skill in folks with little training? Wow, okay, so this is a very important question. I think critical thinking skills is something that we cannot only train on the job. I think this is something that we need to work on our own time. And this is why I highlighted the fact that it was very important for us to familiarize ourselves with the code of ethics. We need to know what the standards mean. We need to know what the tenets mean. We need to take a look at the example. We need to think about situations in which we were in a similar spot and had to solve this kind of dilemma. And that is why critical thinking, and that is why attending these workshops and thinking about strategies and thinking about encounters that we have been in is so important. So do not think about critical thinking as an isolated thing. We do critical thinking in many different aspects of our life, not only in our professional life. So just keep on working on confronting yourself and asking yourselves, what would I do if I were in this presentation or in this situation? How would I react? What are the ethical principles that apply in this case? What dilemmas am I facing? What options do I have? And you need to practice this. You cannot just practice ethical decision making on the spot in an assignment. You need to look at different ethical scenarios and think about it and say, okay, in this scenario, what is the ethical dilemma? How can I solve this? What are the options that I have? What could possible outcomes be? What consequence would it entail if I acted in this manner or if I acted in a different manner? So this is also very important for you to consider. So to develop critical thinking skills, you have to practice them, and you also have to make the code of ethics a second nature to you.
Carola, I missed all of your answer. I don't know why, how I lost connection, but I will rewatch the video to hear your answer, okay? Okay, here's another question. It says, many, okay, no, hold on a second. Okay, there is instead of advocating, how do we redirect any issue that seems to need to be addressed?
Well, it is very hard to answer that question without context. And I would say that it depends. Because we have several different strategies that we can use to address issues that come up in an interpreting encounter. For example, we can intervene, we can ask for clarification. And these are all strategies that do not put the spotlight on us, but that allow us to better understand what is going on in the scenario. Many issues that need to be addressed are not for us as interpreters to be addressed. There's usually other stakeholders or other counterparts that are related to that. If you have a dual role, that is, if you wear multiple hats within a school district, you have to be very aware about the role that you have in that specific moment. If you're interpreting, then you're just there to interpret. And if there's any issue that needs to be addressed outside of the interpreting encounter, you can address that with whoever the counterpart is outside of the interpreted encounter. And that is extremely important because we have to make a clear distinction between when we're working as interpreters and when we're working in a different capacity. So advocating is definitely like the last resort, the last strategy that we need to implement. If we have tried everything else without inserting ourselves in the direct communication between the parties, that is the only instance in which we can advocate. Otherwise, as I said, make sure that when you're working as an interpreter, you're just there to interpret. And if you have a dual role, then address whatever needs to be addressed in that specific capacity with your other hat on and not as the interpreter.
Excellent, excellent advice. Carola, do you have time for one more question?
One more. Let's do one more.
Okay, here it goes. What resources, literature, or websites do you recommend for increasing our critical thinking skills in each of our different fields? Authors or resources that you think highly of?
Man, I should have brought my list. I think one way of doing critical thinking practice is if you have a study group. Do you have a group of colleagues that you get along with very well and who you respect as professionals in the field? Because then you could just create random scenarios with situations that you have been faced with and say, of course, keeping confidentiality always, please, 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 like never share any details. But you can create a scenario from a personal experience by anonymizing all of the identifying key information and saying, okay, in this situation, I encountered this challenge. What would you have done? What are the ethical principles that are at play here? How can we solve it? What are possible outcomes? What could be the consequences if I acted in a certain way, and what could be the consequences if I acted in a different way, and just keep on analyzing and discussing those scenarios. I know that AAITE is working on creating additional resources for these specific items. We held a workshop in March. I'm sure there'll be one coming for the second half of the year. So just sign up to their newsletter and make sure that you stay in touch. And I think that sometimes discussing these kind of scenarios with colleagues is a great way to get the critical thinking skills going and to also discuss in a different way how situation can be managed.
Carola, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. You're a busy lady, let me tell you. You have a family, a husband, children. You have another life, right? Before all the work and the volunteering that you do. Thank you again so much for joining us today, for delivering this fantastic webinar. You know, you're precious to us here at CCC. And again, we wish you the best. Thank you, Carola.
Thank you very much for having me. And I hope that everybody will take a little bit of little something with them home, at least to think about and maybe reconsider some of the ways that they go about interpreting encounters. And thank you also to Hilda for interpreting into Spanish for all of the Spanish speakers out there.
Yes, I'm just going to piggyback from Carola. Thank you so much to Hilda Tejada for volunteering her time and expertise to be able to interpret for those that needed interpretation today. So thank you so much, Hilda. We got great comments about the amazing job that you were doing interpreting simultaneously. Let me tell you, that is a true challenge. Thank you so much.